In the context of this Congress in Athens, courage is not only an issue, not only a question, but it is also a concept particularly relevant to bring up in view of Athens' history as being the locus of the birth of Occidental philosophy. Socrates and Plato identified courage as one of the four main virtues along with justice, wisdom, and temperance. It was also an important notion in redefining the relationship between what one used to call the aristocratic and popular ways of being. In today's world, this point could be seen as a redefinition of socio-economic and democratic conditions. Courage has to do with bringing together a community with leadership and foresight. Courage in this system becomes political courage, an attitude to be found at the center of many revolutionary movements. Alain Badiou, for one, recently published an article in the Monde newspaper on the necessity of this being, the courage of the present as being an essential attitude to develop. One point I think should be stressed is the necessity of linking emotions to courage, and especially rage. As Yvonne Rainer, a figure which many of us admire these days, has said in a very luminous and succinct way, rage makes courage. My insistence on bringing up this topic for this year's Congress comes very much from this figure of thought. How can we use our emotions in order to create change? How can we find the necessary springboard to do so? But first, we must ask ourselves, in the comfort of today, is there any reason to be enraged? Do we even have the ability to be enraged? To what point am I anesthetized by today's everyday condition and filled with an accelerated sense of time, overdetermined stress and agendas, multitasking, and just beating the clock? We are all aware of what is happening in Greece and elsewhere in the world. We are all at terms with public crisis as well as personal dramas. But the question is, where does one find courage in the midst of the turmoil? Thumos, as the ancient Greeks would say, is at the heart of courage. It is the locus of emotions, such as rage, as well as the impetus for thinking out situations and acting upon them. The locus of a moral challenge, and not one of imposing one's moralities on the other, as we could say Germany has tried to do in the recent weeks regarding Greece. A moral challenge comes about when one is called upon to find a new equilibrium between the present and the past, the recent and the future, the present and the future, and this requires reaching out to the other, abandoning the closed-in self, fenced in by personal commitments and obligations, and even more so, illusions brought about by a general consensus on how our lives should be run. Courage has to do with tearing oneself apart from consensus and letting go of habits and illusory goals. It has to do with plunging into the void, imagining a new future for oneself and for others. The worst enemy of courage is fear. Compliance can give the impression that fear can be diminished, that it can go away. Facing fear is necessary because it is the only way that it will truly disappear. Fear is close to ignorance, as ignorance enhances fear and berefts one of the necessary tools to fight it. Many factors can generate fear: timidity, apprehension, but also difference, even melancholia or nostalgia. Possibly these have a lot to do with today's world, as it seems encrusted in the past in old ways of being and making. Political courage today has to do with facing the melancholia or the anomia of the present, and as my colleague of IKT, Wangetan, has made me remember what Doris Lessing calls the paralysis of the will. So to anomia, we must substitute aphobia and confront fear. We must learn to fight personal and collective determinisms, which often come out of human rationalism. Courage has to do with finding the power within. That can only be examined on an individual basis and transferred to a collectivity to become common ground. In the context of this symposium, I have therefore asked 4 individuals coming from different spheres to examine the question of courage from their own perspectives. First, let us say that the Athens location gives rise to an investigation of the Athens riots and the troubles affecting this country. What animates these uprisings and these problems? What do they tell us about the individual's plight in the face of a changing nation, a changing world? How and what do these events make us feel about our global horizon and time? Costas Douzinas, political theorist, professor of law, pro-vice master for international relations, and director of the Birkbeck Institute for the Humanities at the University of London, is a close observer of the current situation in Greece and will contextualize the topic while taking a look at how the subject of courage has traveled through history. Secondly, courage is a basic trope of philosophy. So I have asked a philosopher to outline what this concept means to philosophy and life today. Markus Steinweg, a Berlin-based philosopher who is close to artists including Thomas Hirschhorn and Rosemary Trockel, will talk about self-determination and courage as a necessary act of recklessness, taking risks, seeking new ways, opening new horizons, are part of an amoral dream, says he, and more about that in a few minutes. Thirdly, I have asked also an artist to participate in this moment's presentation on the question of how has courage been explored in artistic practices. Is it possible to espouse the media sphere and contemporary economy and currently prove to be a courageous being? What if one chooses to ignore such a context? Would that be considered courageous or uncourageous? Is courage necessarily political or social? So, Jalal Toufic, a thinker and immortal to death, as he says, and an artist currently living in Istanbul, an artist from Beirut, currently living in Istanbul, has written extensively on the question of courage and will address the question in his terms. Amongst other books, he has recently published The Withdrawal of Tradition Past, a Surpassing Disaster. Fourth and last, how has courage been explored in artistic practices in the post-2000 era? Excuse me. What is it like, rather, to have courage as a curator? What are the motivations? How does one develop as a curator? How can one conceive of courage as a curator? For Pontbriand, as we know, is one of the great reference figures in our profession. It was creating trust. For Johannes Kladers, it was entertaining a process of constant creation aside from consensus. For Alan Simon, keeping out of formal art history. For Anne Darmancourt, making connections, creating encounters, the pedestrian bridge.